Working It Out, a podcast show about diversity, equity, and inclusion in our workplaces, our communities, and our lives. A show where we put diversity and inclusion to work.
Got problems on the job, we're working it out. Workplace got you stressing, we're working it out. Yeah, we're working it out, working it out, working it out.
Welcome to Working It Out. I'm your host, Dr. Vanessa Weaver. As racial tensions continue to grow and the quest to attract and retain Gen Z employees heightens, we'll be discussing a topic that ranges from the negative impact of centering whiteness. So let me restate that term again, centering whiteness, to how activism among Gen Zers influences their choice in the companies they choose to work for. And that's really important because, right now we're dealing with the great resignation where we've lost over 44 million Americans have changed their job just in this year. And so the ability to attract and retain young talent, particularly the Gen Zers and the millennials who have such a commitment to equity and inclusion in a society that embraces all, it's a critical challenge for organizations. So joining us today, I'm so excited that we're going to hear from a Gen Zer. A lot of times on our show, we hear from those folks who've been around, who had a lot of experience and credibility as we defined it. But we're going to be talking today to Austin Heller. And I'm excited about him because in his short lifespan, he has done so much. First of all, he's a senior political scientist student at Kennesaw University in Georgia. And I told Austin, based on what I saw on his resume, he's going to be the president of the United States. And I must tell you, he said that he didn't know if that was such a good idea. But before he grew up into this magnificent person, he was an Army brat. He was a candidate for the Cobb County Board of Education. He was the team lead for Kennesaw State's Civic engagement. And he's worked already in so many roles for political campaigns, from communication consultant to social media specialist to actually the campaign manager. In the state of Georgia, he's managed Nick Miller's campaign. He was the social media manager for Georgia State Representative Park Cannon. And he is just a phenomenal young man. And he has an incredible perspective on this centering whiteness term. We're going to define that in a minute. So I wanted to just welcome Austin Heller to our show today. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Weaver. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's an honor for me because I know that you, with this busy schedule, you had to kind of carve out time for us today. So we talked about this whole notion of centering whiteness. We've dealt with replacement theory concerns, critical race theory. So how do you define this centering whiteness term?
Definitely. We center whiteness in every aspect from housing to education. It's using white narratives to dominate the conversation and to put comfortability over revolution. You see a lot in education where we're looking at history from like the white or the colonialist perspective. And so we're not learning about the impact of certain political policies or actions from past presidents or past Congress people across the world. The prime example is just the lack of knowledge that the average American citizen has on our country's history and impact in the Philippines or in Cuba. And so these isms that we have so centered here also are everywhere else across the globe due to our impact. And so that white centering is not even acknowledging that in the classroom because it could be considered divisive.
So this whole notion of banning critical race theory and other several whites being concerned about being replaced by women and people of color is an example of white centering?
Yes. So The Great Replacement theory is a conspiracy theorist that has been here for a while. It's used by political pundits like Tucker Carlson on some of the most watched news programs across the country. It's just this fear-mongering realist world perspective that the white population is being replaced by a new electorate, whether that's through immigration or through mixed race couples or more children of color being born at higher rates than white children. And it's just a way to incite fear and center white fragility and fear amongst the collective conversation.
So replacement theory, critical race theory, white centeredness is kind of all in the same family.
Yes, it all goes hand in hand. And this huge push kind of started with the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, of this national conversation of banning critical race theory, but not being able to define what is actually being banned. And so most folks don't even know that this theory was concocted in the 1970s by some legal scholars. It was critical legal studies, and it just shows how our systems in housing, in the legal process, in the court process are all inequitable and have not favored particularly Black Americans throughout history. And so banning these types of things, but not labeling exactly what we're banning and what we're discussing, leads to the erasure of so many folks' stories and histories in the classroom.
Well, Austin, I have to ask you, I mean, one of the questions that we often ask our guests is, what is your why? And you fascinate me, but because of just the range of roles that you've played in terms of helping to transform our society, to support candidates who share values and principles around equity. So share with me, how did you get on this track? What is your why? I mean, why do you continually do this and you're still in school full time in your last year? What's your why?
My why, I was raised in an Army family. I saw service growing up. They serve differently than I serve, but we all have our place in society and our perspective. I use the quote, and I'm going to misuse the quote. I can't remember who said it, but we're all just one piece of shattered glass. But when you zoom out and we're all put together is like the mural, the wall. And so you're looking and we're all the mosaic put together. So everyone has their place. And my why, I definitely got a catapult into this work of equity and kind of revolutionary conversations and spaces during the pandemic. We got shut down. I began my schooling as an elementary education major. So I thought I wanted to teach kindergarten, and I wanted to bring inclusive conversations and show children that heroes can look different than them, so that they are not going and developing into folks that are turning 18, 19 and first coming across someone that's a darker shade than them at college. At that point, it's hard to bring someone into the work. But then I decided during the pandemic, there was so much health inequity and so much national conversation about vaccine distribution. And I was sitting here and I was like, well, I can't do that much work in the classroom if I don't have the adequate money to do that. And so that's the state legislature deciding education funding. And so I switched over to political science. I'm minoring in legal studies. So my classes center on the court system and city government. And that's kind of my why. My why is Dr. Dukes, our friend Dante, Britt, our crew that we consider ourselves in Atlanta, of knowing their family, not by blood, but by mission and by area. So they're my why every day.
And I'm proud to share with our audience that Dr. Dukes is a member of our team at Alignment Strategies. So I'm glad she's part of your why there. In fact, she's producing our shows for our podcast. So, we talked about this whole Gen Zer, and we know you shared some important data with us, which I think was like 75% of Gen Zers look at the values that accompany not only spouses, but practices. And this is an area that matters to them, the ability to embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion in those workplaces. So what's your experience in terms of how Gen Zers are reacting to it?
Definitely. So a lot of my friends are, it's the workplace environment. They're interviewing, and they're kind of feeling out like who their employers and who their team workers are going to be. Who is this team comprised of? Am I the only person that looks, sounds, believes, prays the way I do in this workplace? Am I going to have someone that I can connect to? And so I think the national conversation with the election of the first female vice president, the first Black American, first Indian American vice president is kind of spurred. Even I think Gen Alpha is now the one below us, the younger generation coming in. They're seeing people in places that they know they can get to now. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. Like, we're expecting the workforce and the workplace to reflect what America actually looks like and not these echo chambers. And so something I'm doing now, I'm starting to look for places that I might want to work as I'm a year out from graduating, is not just DEI work, but DEIJ work, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work, making sure we take it a step further, yes, with the J, and making sure we're actually
excuse me, because that J just kind of excited me. Why is it important to add the J to the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion? Why is justice important?
I think justice is really important because justice looks like not having these aggressions, whether micro or macro, even happening in the first place, knowing better and doing better. I think DEI work is super, super important, but without the J part of it is kind of just a conversation. We're not implementing things through PowerPoint. We're implementing it through actual practices and patterns and cultures. And it takes years. It takes years to establish culture that actually is inclusive and equitable. And so a lot of people know that graphic that is like a huge thing that people share of like the folks that can't see into the baseball game. And so the father picks the kid up on his shoulders, and that's equity. Like the middle child was tall enough to look over the fence, so they didn't need to be put on their shoulders, versus equality. But the justice part takes that graphic further, and it takes the fence from being at the game in the first place away. And so everyone can see no matter what they need to be successful. So I think the J is arguably the most important part of the work.
Okay, so we're going to start adding J to ours as well. Thank you for that. So Austin, I'm just curious. I mean, you identify as a white male, am I correct?
Yes, yes.
So how do you feel talking about this to other whites? And I ask that because a lot of times in the DEI work, you see women and in particular people of color who are doing the heavy lifting around that in the corporations and the workplaces. And here you are, a very young, experienced white male. How do you leverage your own whiteness to engage in other whites about some of the inequities that you're fighting against?
Definitely. It's just an unfortunate truth sometimes that sometimes it takes someone who kind of looks similar to somebody else for the message to be even able to get in the door. And sometimes if I'm not actively looking for the work, if I'm someone that's very centered and I grew up in a very homogenous area, everyone looked and believed the same as me. And I'm getting to a place at a university where I've never interacted with a Black person before, other than a, hey, how are you doing at the gas station? Then this is the perfect prime time to like recenter and rework where they're going forward. Privilege comes with it power. And so using power, it's just, I use the Superman versus Lex Luthor analogy of like, they both had power. It was just how they decided to use it. Lex wanted to take over the world and dominate people, and Superman wanted to help liberate Metropolis. And so you have to use your power in the way that is best suited for you. And so those types of conversations, people can tell you, I will turn everything into a justice conversation. It could be, oh my gosh, traffic was so bad. And I always bring up, yeah, if we had better public transit, but they don't want cities to connect to suburbs because of racial tension and policies throughout history. I can turn everything into a justice conversation where people are, meeting them where they are, telling them that, you know, you're going to stumble. Like, just because I've been doing this work doesn't mean that I'm not going to commit racial harm, either intentionally or unintentionally. And so knowing that I'm still going to stumble, but that I commit to changing and commit to doing the work forward is really how I get people to join in and have those types of conversations with me.
So they're actually joining in and having these kind of candid conversations with you?
Yes, definitely. And sometimes I do receive a little bit of an adverse reaction. It's not always going to be perfect. I think it's repetition. I think hearing and seeing these things. I think social media is a double-edged sword. It lets folks like Andrew Tate spread really, really awful messaging, but it also allows folks to see, like, if they meet me as an RA on campus in housing and they follow me, and my social media is informing them about certain topics that they wouldn't have found in their friend group that came from their hometown, then it's a win. And so they click on the link and they read a little bit more, or they slide up and they ask a question for me. And so I can help break down things to them. And I get informed a lot from them as well on how to approach conversations. I served on our training and development task force for housing and residence life at KSU. And I put a really big emphasis on a diversity and equity section being included in our RA training, because our residents that are moving in are coming from all over Georgia and across the country. And we need RAs that are equipped to handle those types of conversations. So reaching one person allows you to reach their entire network. And so when they're able to take your conversation that you had with them and spread it to their family, and then they can take it to their work, and it grows like that.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. So, you talked to us about a term, decentering whiteness. And so I know we have centering whiteness and decentering whiteness. But what is the decentering whiteness? How would you define that to our audience? Because it sounds like a lot of what you're doing is, in fact, decentering whiteness.
Definitely. Decentering whiteness is possibly is really easily explained as like centering the voices of the community that you're trying to advocate with and for. A lot of the times white liberals commit actual more racial harm than these white conservative folks are doing, because this savior complex that we've like attached to folks like Abraham Lincoln, or certain celebrities like Angelina Jolie, even where we're using like a savior complex. It's like, we committed all this harm, now I feel like I need to be a hero and save the world. And we should be amplifying like a megaphone. And so I'm just here to be a megaphone for folks across all types of communities, whether it's an LGBTQ community, whether it's a Latinx community. My mom's side of the family is Japanese and Mexican descent, and then my dad is fully 100% white German. And so knowing that I can use my voice as an amplifier, not as the message itself. Centering Black artists. I think something that I talk to white folks about a lot is, show up for Black folks in America the way that you show up for Black NBA stars when you want to watch them play an NBA basketball game. And so we have folks that love J. Cole, or they love watching LeBron James play, but then when those same folks' lives are being threatened by police or by societal injustices, are silent. And so I always ask people to keep that energy. Folks shouldn't have to be giving you something, entertainment, music, profits, in order for you to care about them and advocate for them.
Well, let me ask you this, Austin, because we talked about the fact that Gen Zers, millennials, and even younger generations have a certain expectation around how organizations show up in dealing with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So give some advice. We have a lot of our listeners are, working for companies or working for the government, working for these big organizations. What should they think about when they're interviewing or trying to attract a millennial? So if you could tell them 3 things that they needed to be very sensitive about, what would you advise them to do?
Definitely. I think number one, asking very specific, catered questions that relate to an identity that you hold. If you're a single mother working at a company, asking, how am I going to be supported by y'all if there becomes an emergency with my child, because my family comes first. Asking questions of, there are certain holidays. I'm not Christian, and I have certain holidays throughout the workforce that maybe are not federally recognized as holidays where I'm able to take off. Or am I going to be granted that time off, or will that become an issue? Understanding, I may become a pregnant person. Me and my spouse and partner are planning to have a child. How does that look and fit into my career here? Asking about upward mobility. What does the leadership team look like? That's number two. Seeing like, do all of the managerial and supervising roles all identify as white men, and then having a bunch of lower division diverse spaces. And then three, asking how feedback works at a company or organization. How do I bring up a concern to you, and then how is it handled across the board? Do y'all have panels? Do you call in a team meeting? Is this a one-on-one type thing? And kind of understanding the work culture is probably the most important step, just to make sure when you get to work, you're not like dreading, hiding, holding back your authenticity from 9 to 5. That's a big weight on someone's shoulders to like water down who they are as a person. And so asking questions like, how can my identity further the mission statement of this organization?
Wow, those are some incredible questions, and questions that a millennial should be asking as they're interviewing. So now I'm working for the company. I'm doing the interview. What would you say I need to be asking, or at least conveying, about the company's commitment to attract that millennial person? And not just saying it because in the moment you're trying to hire somebody, but what are those selling points that I might need to express, or really make sure get out there, in the hopes that we could get that person to join my company or a company?
Definitely. I think asking how, if you're hired, can we show up for you fully and entire in your entirety? I think yeah, so my number one thing is when I meet a new friend and I'm having a conversation with them and I'm having them become a part of my circle, is like, how do I show up for you? And how does that look for you? And like, what is considered to be overstepping for you? And how do I make sure that I'm centering what you need and who you are? We're raised by a generation from our parents and their generation before them that color blindness was key to being inclusive, of like, I don't see you for anything just as a human being. But what that does is it denies huge parts of who people are. It denies culture, it denies history, it denies the political implications of who you are as a person. And so as a supervisor and interviewer of an executive at a company, saying like, how do I make sure that I'm valuing you in your entirety as a person and who you are specifically? That lets the worker know you're coming in and you're seeing them fully. I see you as a beautiful Black queer woman, not just Cindy, my employee. And how do I show up for that person at work? And I think that one question and elaborating on it would definitely attract me as an employee.
How do I show up for you? That's powerful. So now I'm kind of I got a sense of how I can connect in this conversation or interview with a Gen Z or millennial. What is one thing I need to avoid doing or saying?
Definitely. I think our generations are noticing that like this, it's a toxic work environment a lot of places, where your quality of like your evaluations are based on productivity. How much did you produce for us this week? And that ignores that like companies are made up of people. And so hopefully, if I ever supervise folks in the future at any place that I'm at, I'm going to invest in people, and the people that are going to then help build a company and an enterprise. You don't build an enterprise without other folks. And so, especially as you become a larger corporation nationally or in a region, you need to make sure that you're investing in folks that are here in the now, and letting them know like, I'm here for you as a person. And so I don't want to rate like you did a good job this week because you completed 50 tasks, and then not tell employee B that they also did a good job because they only completed 25. That person may have had a grandmother that passed away due to a cancer fight. That person may have just had a rough day. And so I don't want to be evaluated explicitly on tasks. And it's a double-edged sword sometimes too. We want to make sure that we're actually like holding people accountable to like doing things that they've agreed to do in a contract or whatever. But we also have to humanize folks and let them know like, we understand that this isn't a bunch of robots that like don't need rest, and these are people. So avoid robotic.
Well, you are absolutely incredible. I'm sitting up here listening to you, and I'm just getting pumped by your awareness and your passion, and your commitment for this. So I guess I would love to hear from you. If there was one approach that you would share for white centering to address with white centering. I know you've given us some examples, but I love to leave our listeners with what do you think would be the biggest or the most impactful way that an individual, a person of color or a woman or even a millennial could address a person that's clearly in the space of white centering?
Definitely. I think I do this presentation at KSU with our Center for Student Leadership, and I call it Talk With Me, Not At Me. And so sometimes it's about calling people in versus calling them out. And so sometimes if the conversation is very like white centering, or it's very egotistical, or very like selfish and self-righteous too, you have to like call them in. So like maybe the time is later that afternoon. You know, you have a meeting with them scheduled on your calendar, just you two, and you can pull them in and kind of speak to them. It's also, if you're a white employee, recognizing something happening, that another harmful thing being perpetrated by another white employee to someone of color or a woman or any minority group in the workplace, of like sometimes like I would definitely approach the employee that you're kind of worried or concerned for, instead of speaking up for them kind of like impulsively, because some people don't want to be advocated for. And sometimes you don't know how to advocate for that person and how they need to be advocated for as well. So having that type of conversation with them. I think my number one piece of advice, especially when we're intaking media, is asking, who is this person presenting this information or this fact to me? Where else can I get it from? And is there a source that the information is regarding that I actually identifies with that group? So like on Juneteenth, maybe celebrating Black owned businesses is a better move than like going to Walmart or a national corporation, or what we call I think it's cultural tourism, or when your people are flocking to Hawaii, but then they're only spending money at these large corporations. And so the local businesses are actually going bankrupt. And so we're not only like killing the climate in Hawaii with all the travel, but then these white tourists are coming to Hawaii. And then instead of spending money at native folks' businesses, they're spending it at large corporations. And that's not helpful. So just asking a question on, is there a way that I can include someone in the conversation that isn't speaking or is being dominated over? And where else can I get this information from? And then doing a little bit deep research that way. So
that's extremely helpful. Thank you so much for that. Well, Austin, it's been a short show, and I would love to have you back on to talk even more about this topic, about white centering and decentering whiteness and replacement theory, critical race theory. But more than that, how can organizations become even more attractive places for millennials and for Gen Zers to choose them as a place that they want to start their career or continue their career? So on behalf of our alignment strategies and working it out team, I just want to thank you for the time that you shared with us and the insights you shared with us. They've just been so enlightening. Thank you so much, Austin.
Thank you so much. It was really fun being here. I would definitely love to come back sometime.
You definitely will. And plus some other things I'm thinking about as I listen to you. But thank you so much. So on behalf of our Working It Out podcast crew, I wish you a safe, productive, and a be happy week. I'm your host, Dr. Vanessa Weaver. Goodbye.
Working It Out is brought to you by Alignment Strategies, a management consultancy with more than 3 decades of experience in diversity, equity and inclusion, and organizational development. To learn more, visit alignmentstrategies.com.
Got problems on the job, we're working it out. Workplace got you stressing, we're working it out. Yeah, we're working it out, working it out, working it out.